So one of the most important goals of AHA is to provide a sense of community for non-religious or atheist students on campus here. But kids these days really have no idea how good they have it. It turns out that the organized secular or atheist student movement is really less than 20 years old. You can trace its origins back to the mid to late 90s when the Center for Inquiry had a group called the Campus Freethought Alliance, which was the first attempt to organize atheist students. And our next speaker of this afternoon, Debbie Goddard, was there in the very early days. She was a student president of the CFA in 2002. And she would go on to be hired by the Center for Inquiry when the CFA changed its name to Center for Inquiry on Campus, as it's known today. Debbie was hired as a field organizer, and now she is the director of organizing for CFI on campus. She's also involved in a lot of other projects, such as being the director of the African Americans for Humanism, and she's also a blogger over at Skeptic. This is, I believe, the third time we brought her to Madison, and we're so happy to have her back again. So please join me in welcoming Debbie Goddard.
Hello. Is this on? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Those who can't, raise your hand. No, you're good. All right. So, there isn't much time, and there's a lot that I could talk about because this is a very exciting topic to me, and it should be to you too. And this is the first time I'm doing this specific presentation, although I've talked a lot about pieces of this at different times. Then I cobbled some together in a way that I hope is effective for helping you to remember how some of this could work. Let me start by giving you a little bit of background on this and why I wanted to talk about this topic here, and I'm more interested in seeing more people talk about how to do activism and how to do organizing. And I'm going to make sure I pay attention to time. I did different kinds of activism through high school, but the first time I plugged into a movement or a community that was doing activism was when I got involved with the LGBTQ community in Philadelphia in 1998. I went to rallies, I held signs outside of City Hall, I attended vigils for members of the community who died, handed out pamphlets and condoms on campus, did a lot of these kinds of things. I was also tangentially involved in reproductive rights issues and some other progressive issues in the area because of my friends' network. And at this time, I often found that my opponents on these issues, the people on the other side of the issues that I was fighting for, I believed many of them were motivated by what I would call bad thinking, bad reasoning, often religious thinking. And for example, with LGBTQ equality, I talked to people who would quote back to me what their pastors believed or what they thought that the Bible said about homosexuality. So I thought that if I got involved in teaching people how to think critically about issues, and that involved questioning what their pastors would tell them on Sunday morning, or questioning what they thought was in the Bible, or actually looking at what's in the Bible and understanding that would be fundamental to changing how people thought about these issues, like same-sex marriage, marriage equality, like abortion rights. And I became a philosophy major in college because I was interested in learning how to teach critical thinking better. So when I learned about the Freethought movement in college in 2000, when I was 20, I was very, very excited to find that there was already an organized movement out there that was promoting these principles of better thinking based on reason and evidence, and not on superstition, whether it be religious or pseudoscientific. And I put all of my volunteer energies into the Freethought movement, thinking, again, that was foundational to change. And I'm looking down more than I want to be, not because I can't tell these stories, but because I'm trying to keep myself to not rambling about these stories and actually staying on time. So I worked with a lot of groups in Philadelphia for about 5 years, from 2000 to 2005. I joined basically every skeptic, atheist, freethought, humanist group within 100 miles of me, which included New York City, because I was really, really excited to find all this. And eventually I was hired by CFI in 2006 to continue this work. I also worked with campus groups and doing outreach there. Funny enough, I thought I could get better at my job and better at being an outreach coordinator and community organizer by learning more about philosophy and history and science. And so when I read books, it was about the philosophy of science or the history of the Enlightenment, for example. Because the people I saw around me, very smart people, and not just at CFI but in the movement in general, could rattle off the contradictions of the book of Genesis, the history of the Jesus story, and where the Jesus myth might have been created from, things like that. So I thought if I learned this, I could be a better organizer. It was only after several years of working at CFI that I realized that I could be a better activist and organizer by studying activism and organizing. Like, it was a real revelation to me. I was excited. I told other people about, like, did you know there are books about this stuff? Did you know? I just read this whole article about the civil rights movement and the Martin Luther King methods versus the Malcolm X methods. I read this about LGBTQ movements. There's a lot we could learn from this and apply to what we're doing. But I didn't see anyone really talking about it at that time. This is like 2009-ish. About how we could be better organizers and activists. And I just dove right in. We got books from labor movement. I started studying feminist movement history, not just the development of the ideas, but the different actions that people took, what they tried to accomplish, whether they're successful at that. And it's been a journey since then. I'm not an expert at it, but I feel like I'm a senior undergraduate, and there's PhDs out there or something like that. But I'm very, very excited about it. And yet when I talk to a lot of people who are organizers or just community members or involved in commenting on the blogosphere about how we can think strategically about our activism or why we should do the things that we're trying to do in our movement, they're not approaching it from this perspective of thinking about how to do effective action. And we're not taking what we understand about psychology and sociology to be better activists and be better at shifting the world. So that's my approach for doing this topic. Those are the kinds of things I want to talk about right now. That we can learn how to do activism better. We're good at talking about big ideas, and we're good at debating and arguing, and we tend to be a bright crowd. We're good at taking principled stands on issues. But we're not always good at taking those ideas out of the theoretical and putting them into the practical and the actual, thinking about how people actually work, how the world actually works, and therefore whether we should do certain things or how we can best do them. To be more effective as activists, we need to think pragmatically and strategically about what actions we should take and whether those actions should be effective. And I'm going to say that a lot of times in this talk so that it sticks in your heads, so that when we think about how to do things, you say, we should really think strategically about this. We should really think about whether this action will be effective. We should consider our goals and how to accomplish those. Because we can do more effective activism. How does this sound so far? You excited, or you just shut up and get on with your slideshow? All right. All right, good. I studied philosophy long enough to want to start by defining my terms. Since I'll be using these words a lot, I'd like you to know what our shared understanding is of them. So what is activism? Very simply, doing something to change things, taking action to bring about change. There are different kinds of activism. Often people divide it into two major categories of political versus social. In other words, are you trying to have an effect on policy, law, affect politicians, or are you trying to have an effect in a general community sort of not through political channels? There are other words that people have applied to what kinds of activism we're doing, environmental, economic, judicial, for example. A lot of these principles that I'll be talking about can be applied to all of these. I'll also be talking about organizing. And what I basically mean by that in this context is just bringing people together to do something. There's a lot of jargon in organizing land, in community organizing, talking about mobilizing, empowering, talking about building leadership, educating certain populations. I'm going to not use those words. What does mobilizing mean anyway? What do we mean by that? But you can hear that easily. I'm just going to be talking about getting people together to do something, to do activism. And why should we be concerned with how to do activism better? I hope for this audience I don't need to convince you that things could be better in the world. They're not always great. And we can help shift things. Even if they're small things, we can have an effect and we can change things, each one of us. Even when I worked in a pizza shop as one of my 3 jobs after college when I was super broke, I talked to my coworkers about some of the ideas that I was interested in, and I changed their mind on different things. Some of it was about vaccinating their kids or taking their kids to the doctor. Some of it was about same-sex marriage. These are voters I was talking to, right? And that was just in my little pizza shop world. So even if we don't have much time or energy, we can be agents of change. Now, I'm not going to cover everything I can because there's not much time. So I'm dividing this into 2 sections. First, I'll be talking about big picture campaigns. When we talk about how to think strategically about doing something, I found this campaign framework to be very, very useful. And then I'll talk about some individual ideas and tactics that we can all learn and use to be more persuasive and better activists. So let's talk about campaigns. What is a campaign? It's kind of like a project. Don't be put off by the word campaign. Often we think about political campaigns, right? Or they're issue-based campaigns, advertising campaigns. But the idea is that it's sort of a project of actions. Actions are the tasks, campaign is the project. In an advertising campaign, the goal may be get more people to buy your project or your product. An election campaign is get your candidate in office, right? Or defeat the other candidate. Sometimes that's the actual reason. There's a method for making effective campaigns. I wouldn't say a science because it's a squishy and soft science, and there are variations on this method. But it's very helpful to use this framework when we're thinking about how to take actions together to change something. So, what is a campaign? The first thing we can think about as part of a campaign is to set a goal. Sometimes goals are reactive. Often, in fact, they're reactive. Something's wrong and we want to do something about it. We're reacting to a thing. We tend to have a very specific goal and a specific timeline. These can be pie in the sky, like how do we want the world to be that's different than it is now? But this helps set the vision, and when you're working with people and you refer back to the shared vision, okay, yeah, this is what we're trying to accomplish. It's very useful. Within this campaign, after you think about your goal, you can set your objectives. Objectives are winnable issues. They're like smaller goals. And a lot of people don't make the distinction between goals and objectives, and that's fine. Often they're measurable things that you can do. I'll run through an example actually after I go through these. There's often a primary objective that you're trying to accomplish, and there are secondary, smaller objectives. When you think about the success of your campaign, you're measuring against whether you accomplish these objectives. Third, and I can't stress how important this is, think about your target audience. Who are you talking to, and who has the power to affect the change that you want to see? After you think of these pieces, then you should determine your tactics. What are you going to do? Who are you talking to? What are you going to say to them? And these are the specific actions you and your group carry out to achieve your objectives with the target audience in mind. And 5, which I wasn't going to include because it's generally what you do after you finish actually implementing your campaign, is evaluation. But I actually have found it useful to think about, even before we start a campaign, how we will measure our success. What success looks like. When the campaign's over, what are we going to sit down and do to say, did we succeed at this? What should we have done differently, whatever. I've found it useful to think of that even before we get started to help set our objectives and consider who our target audiences might be. There are other aspects of campaign building that we could drill into, like how to determine what messaging would be most effective, how to manage a leadership team and volunteers, what kinds of metrics are useful for evaluation, but that's a lot of information and it's secondary to this important structure. Building campaigns following this method or this framework has helped me think about the work I do more strategically and has helped me to become a more effective activist. It's also helped me to think about other campaigns and activism efforts. And I hope it's one of the major things that you take away from this presentation. Now, I know this seems like a very formal structure. It's got the numbers and the letters and this list. But more casually, if something sticks, you can think about it this way. You're sitting with people and you're like, hey, there's this problem. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to do? What's our dream? What should be different? Okay, cool. How can we do that? Who are we trying to talk to when we do this? And why are we trying to talk to those people? What's the message we're going to bring? What do we want to say? So it doesn't have to be always sit down, get out your paper, fill out the worksheet, put down your goal objectives, whatever. So let's think about a couple of examples to help make this alive. Here's an easy one. It's not always so easy. Problem. Some parents in your community believe that Wi-Fi is harmful to their children. And this has actually happened in a lot of different areas. A couple years ago, it was Western Canada somewhere. They were trying to ban Wi-Fi from schools and public areas. And you think, that's BS. I need Wi-Fi at Starbucks. And also it's very important in schools, and this is pseudoscience. We need to do something about this. Your goal then is prevent the elimination of Wi-Fi in public areas, and particularly in schools. Your primary objective then, your focus, something that a winnable goal, persuade the school board not to eliminate the Wi-Fi. Secondary objective, because it's a bunch of parents coming together and trying to ban the Wi-Fi from everywhere, you want to educate the public on the science regarding Wi-Fi and radiation and things. So who's your target audience? Obviously, considering your objectives, school board officials. You need to be able to talk to them. Also, parents. They're the ones who are trying to bring these issues to the school board. Also, the general public, because there are other people that are making noise and spreading misinformation, and you're trying to counter that. What are your tactics? Well, we're trying to talk to the school board. So, how do you talk to the school board? Go to a school board meeting. How do you talk to parents? Join parenting groups. Print out some flyers for parents to give. Make a website, maybe. So you can provide information to the public and to parents. And research things so you can present it to the school board. That's like basically how to build a campaign. A lot of times, people grab a tactic, they have a general principle, and they seize upon a tactic that's related to the principle, but they haven't considered who it is they're talking to or who's going to actually end up seeing their message and why they're doing that thing. If you want to think strategically, you also have to consider your limited resources, your limited time, whatever other impediments there might be for you to get your message out there, and how effective you're interested in being with these goals. Sometimes it's fun to engage in tactics just because like we're activists and we're people and it's fun to just do things, but if you want to be effective, you should consider who you're talking to and what you're trying to accomplish when you determine what you're actually doing. So I have a couple examples that I've worked on or have seen people work on. I'm actually going to skip one that's longer about the African Americans for Humanism campaign, but there's Candace. It was great, guys. And talk about one that actually took place that was relevant to here. In 2009, I was contacted by a student group leader from the CFI on campus group at Broward College in Florida. He wanted CFI to get behind this new day he and a couple other people had created called Blasphemy Day International. I thought it was in line with CFI's goals, and I had a phone call with him. I was like, what do you imagine? I have some ideas. What are we trying to do? And he said, well, free expression is really important. We should do it on September 30th. This year is going to be the 5th anniversary of the publication of Danish Muhammad cartoons. I was like, oh man, it's like a great anniversary. We'll totally get attention for this. And he's like, yeah, so I imagine like we can have events in places around the world and get the world out and have like rallies about free expression issues. I was like, yeah, totally. He's like, yeah, and I imagine like we can have printouts and downloadable posters with like Muhammad fucking a pig on them so like people can stand up for blasphemy. And I was like, lost you there. Like, why? Why would we do that? Why? He's like, because, you know, we got to blaspheme if you want to show people about this issue. And I was like, but why? Why do we need to do that one? Like, we can do that, but I don't know why we're doing that. And he's like, you gotta show people. I'm like, which people? How will I change your mind about anything except that we're a bunch of dicks? Like, I'm not really sure. And so we sort of realized that we had somewhat different goals in mind, but we had at least some way to think about like who we're talking to, what message we're trying to get out, beyond our principles, like, is standing outside of the State House in Austin, Texas with posters of Muhammad and pigs and also like a CFI logo in the corner, is that going to be good? What is that going to accomplish? Are there better messages that we can get across considering our major goals about education on these issues and people taking action regarding dissidents in other countries? And so we decided to knowing that this campaign could take off online without us having any ability to rein that wild horse, we decided to make a website and a campaign whose main purpose would be educational and secondarily advocacy focused. So when people looked at International Blasphemy Rights Day, which is what we ended up calling it with the word rights in there, so the focus shifted, they would know that it was part of a campaign for free expression. They would have all this information about what we were trying to do, and they could do whatever they wanted on Facebook, but sort of the messaging of the campaign and the primary framing would be this educational and advocacy work. And we organized events in cities around the world and campuses, mostly in the US and Canada, on blasphemy, highlighting the cases of different dissidents being punished for speaking out around the world, had petitions to sign, educational activities, things like that. As far as I know, at least in meat space, we didn't have Muhammad and pigs involved. Online there was a lot of stuff, and there still is every year on Blasphemy Day, and that's fine. Here, actually in 2010, South Park had an episode where they were going to portray Muhammad. And it's Cartoon Network that shows them? Comedy Central? I forget, I always get confused, I don't have cable. Comedy Central said, nope, and wanted them to censor that image, and actually did censor it. Do you remember this? Yeah, Chris remembers. A cartoonist in Seattle did a cartoon where she tongue-in-cheekily proposed, everybody draw Muhammad Day. And this became a popular idea online. A day was chosen in May of, I think, 2010, and people promoted the idea that everyone should draw Muhammads, particularly on college campuses. There was campus groups mostly that were interested in this. AHA here decided to participate in this campaign, and I stole these from Chris's blog post from back then, chalking Muhammads on campus, which is a tactic. Now the Muslim Student Association, is that what they're called? Weren't happy with this, and according to Chris's blog post that I dug up a couple days ago when I decided to talk about this, they were waiting too with chalk by, I guess, the student union to counteract the messages, and turned a lot of the Muhammads into Muhammad Ali by drawing boxing gloves on them and putting the word Ali there. Of course this was unacceptable. So And I think this is absolutely wonderful and hilarious that the student group decided to see just how far this went. If they couldn't draw Muhammad, was this still Muhammad? Is this still unacceptable? According to one religion's guidelines about what's blasphemous and what's okay? Is that one okay? Now, there were a lot of people who thought online, there were articles in different spaces saying, why would you do this? This is offensive. This is pointless. You're marginalizing an already marginalized community. If you think about this, of how this developed, you can say, even as we're going up to Everybody Draw Muhammad Day or Draw Muhammad Day, people, at CFI we had a discussion about whether or not to get behind this effort. And we ended up being kind of quiet on it because we had disagreements, plus our own focus with International Blasphemy Rights Day. If you were looking at this strategically, you would ask the questions, what are we trying to accomplish? What's our goal? And you could say, what's the problem? What's our goal? What are our objectives? Who's our target audience? And some people thought the target audience was, especially the critics of this campaign, Muslim students. We'll show those Muslims that we're not afraid. And some thought it was just educational campaign for the public at large. We'll show people that we're not afraid and we won't be cowed by these, by people bowing to the rules of minority religions or religions in general. So their campaigns to block Muhammad on TV won't work to stop there from being representations of Muhammad. One possible objective was to increase the number of targets out there. So there weren't just things like South Park and the cartoonists who drew the original Draw Muhammad Day cartoon. But if 2,000 people are chalking Muhammad's, who's going to be targeted? There's of course the idea of demonstrating solidarity, which is sometimes a hard thing to measure. What does that mean? Who are we demonstrating for? Who's getting involved? What does that accomplish? Chris, I really liked what Chris wrote. I'm going to read this paragraph before I go on now that I've talked about this. I'm not answering all these questions for you, by the way. I'm just saying, when you think strategically, these are the kinds of things you think about regarding these campaigns. Chris said, regarding defending the idea that the campus group, I'm staring at you, the campus group should engage in this, said, we must all eventually come to the agreement that no religion, person, idea, or sacred cow should be granted immunity from criticism. In a free society, even opinions which a majority may find reprehensible have the right to be heard. Among these is the right to criticize religion and to perform actions considered blasphemous. When that right is under threat, as is clearly the case today, we have a moral obligation to exercise it, to ensure that it is not lost. We cannot tolerate limitations to our freedom of expression, whether they come from violence, intimidation, or self-censorship out of political correctness. Now, one reason I wanted to mention this issue is because it comes up again and again with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. And I wonder if you still agree with this or if your ideas have shifted, but we'll go on from here. With the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, there was some discussion about whether people should repost what some thought were racist, offensive cartoons which targeted a minority community which is marginalized not just in France but in a lot of the Western world. There's a way to think about those kinds of questions when we're talking about how to decide whether to take action and why we do it. This framework, yay! Are we good there? Isn't it exciting?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much that we can think about with this. With Ferguson, people are like, why are they blocking traffic? We can ask that and then think about it and see what the organizers have said about why they're blocking traffic. With the Reason Rally or other rallies, why are we rallying? Why do atheists feel the need to come together and do anything? And rallies are kind of a funny category because a lot of the purpose of rallies is not to talk to the politicians you're shaking your fists at, but to mobilize and energize the people who are attending the rally, right? When we discuss, we can learn more about this kind of thing, about campaigns and action, what's more effective, what's less effective, by studying other movements, like feminism, LGBTQ movement, labor movement, civil rights. And we do. There are people in the secular community who talk about firebrand versus diplomat, for example. What we're trying to accomplish with these different tactics, whether it works, what's more effective. Before moving on to the second part, I want to just highlight one point again that I didn't make explicitly clear, I think, but I mentioned this morning. And that is that in activism, when thinking about activism and organizing, our medium is people. We are trying to change or persuade people to change their beliefs, their values, their attitudes, and their behaviors. We might be interested in saving the whales. How do we save the whales? We need to convince other people to take action about that, right? We might be interested in seeing same-sex marriage legalized everywhere. We need to convince people about that. If we want recycling to increase, we need to talk to people. And people are frustrating and aggravating and annoying and stubborn and hard to work with, both within our own movement and on the other side of these issues. And it's hard, and it's easy to get burned out on these things. Even when we're working with our friends, sometimes they're the worst. They don't listen to us, and when we're activists, we tend to be stubbornly committed to the idea that we're right and we need to persuade everyone else without necessarily listening to other people about whether they could be right. So the funny thing about this is that working with people and fighting other people is one of the most frustrating things about activism, if not the most frustrating thing, but it's also the most rewarding, because it's for people that we're trying to make this world a better place. Sometimes animals too, and trees, but mostly people. And that brings me to my second part, which is that brains are dumb. Brains are really dumb. Brains are not good at being rational, but they're really good at thinking they're being rational. And I tell myself this like every, maybe 3-4 times a month. When I get frustrated at a thing, I'm just like, God, people. Brains are so dumb, they're just squishy things in our heads, what the hell? Really. So we like to think that people are reasonable and make decisions after carefully considering the evidence and seeing, rational arguments about things. We like to believe that we can convince people with arguments and evidence and reason. But most decisions that we think are so carefully made, we'd like to pretend are so carefully made, are actually the result of complex emotions and social pressures, and many of them are the result of just habits we're in. And we're very good at justifying and rationalizing our conclusions after they've already been drawn. So emotions and feelings play a huge role in the choices and decisions we make. As activists, remember again, you're trying to persuade people to change their beliefs, their attitudes, and their behavior. So when we talk about how to get better at this and how to study this, I'm not going to be able to teach you everything right now, obviously, but I want to give you some tools for thinking about how to learn more about this and get better at this. I thought that if I studied philosophy, I would get better at logic and making arguments, and that would change people's minds. And that's part of it too. But if we want to be better at persuading people to change their values, beliefs, behaviors, we need to pay attention to fields that talk about people's values, beliefs, behaviors, particularly psychology, social psychology, sociology, marketing, which has to do with people's behaviors, trying to get people to buy things effectively, for example. So in these fields, you're thinking about how people actually behave, not some idealism of how we wish they did, but how they actually behave and what motivates them to change their minds. So let's talk about some psychology studies that we can learn from. This is about priming. A study in 2008 showed that people associate warm people with a warm feeling and cold people with a cold feeling. But they also associate warm things with warm people. And that was a little bit of a confusing way to explain that. But I'll tell you how the study worked. Volunteers came in a building and they were tricked into holding a drink. The researcher handed them a drink and said, "Oh yeah, we're going to go upstairs for something. Can you just hold on to this while I write down your name and things on this clipboard for the study, check you off the list." Half of those people were handed a warm beverage. The other half, a cold beverage. They weren't aware that this was what the study was about, right? They were then asked to read about a fictional character and rate how cold or warm they found them. And then this is so stupid. What do you think happened? Most people who held the warm drink rated the fictional character as warm. Most people who held the cold drink rated the fictional character as cold. And there are some questions about how this study was done, but these connections with warmth and coldness, because there were only, I think, 41 volunteers in this one, but these connections have been shown time and time again in psychological research. That's not all. Holding warm and cold things also increased, or also affected their selfishness. In another one, because they thought, well, the researchers certainly knew the temperature of the beverage, so maybe that affected it, right? We want to eliminate variables. In one, the people were asked to hold therapeutic pads, like heating pads or cooling pads. And then they were believing they were evaluating a medical product. Once they completed the questionnaire about the pads, they were offered either choice of a drink for themselves or a voucher they could give to a friend. The ones who had the cold packs were more likely to choose a gift for themselves. The ones with the warm packs were more likely to choose a gift for a friend. I don't want this to be how brains work, but it seems to be how they work. Another study, which I think is hilarious, showed that they looked at how many people picked up their litter in a cafeteria. And then some days they put posters of flowers on the wall, and other days they put posters of eyes. This is so silly. When they put the eyes up, more people clean up after themselves. And they're like, that's weird, let's try it again. Let's put eyes by the honesty box, like having free coffee, well, coffee that you can take, but they ask you to put money into a box to cover the cost. Let's put eyes on that box. See if people pay and give more. People gave 3 times more when there were eyes on the box, or in the room, it was on the poster room. There was more. The same researchers, they've done so many of these now where they're like, let's put eyes there, see what happens. They're like, they're bike thieves on our campus. What if we put eyes by the bike rack? Guess what? It reduced bike thefts by 62%. So these are like fun psychology studies. I try to like find these in different venues. I subscribe to a couple newsletters, like the Big Think newsletter, which is generally corny, but occasionally they're like, hey, this is a new finding that just happened. And we send these around in the outreach department like, hey, can we use this in the future? I mean, this is fun. How can we use this kind of thing as activists? Well, let's say I want to implement a recycling program at my job or my school, and there hasn't been one. So we put out these new recycling bins everywhere. But everyone's already in the habit of just chucking their food right in there. Just throwing away their soda cans, their milk bottles, whatever it is. Are there still milk bottles? I was like 1950 all of a sudden. So how can we get more people to recycle? Let's put some eyes on it. Put some eyes on the trash can and be like, you should recycle that. Don't throw that can away. Put it in the blue bin. And that'll change the rates of recycling. I get so mad at this sometimes. I'm like, brains, they're so stupid. By the way, I was going to show you that, which was, why did I cut out the science-y information above and actually show this chart although it's too small for any of you to read? You're more likely to believe me if I do. See this chart? It says so. See how long that line is? Don't believe me, let me show you another one. This one, which is actually the exact same information in a different direction. It's really effective to put charts on your information and sciencey looking things. And if you say, well, I know that, I'm a smart person, I know how science works, I'm not fooled by those charts, guess what? The researchers who came up with the study that resulted in this of putting charts and seeing how much more likely people were to accept a certain bunch of information said, well, maybe people who are scientifically literate are less likely to fall for this. So they asked subjects to rate their agreement with the statement, I believe in science, on a scale of 1 to 9. They found that people who said they strongly believed in science were more likely to be swayed by these bar graphs. I tell you. Do I have to end? What? All right, I have a few minutes left. This is so fun. This is fun. It's so fun. All right, I'm going to pick things to say and not say. Or I'll say them really quickly. Foot in the door, another technique. You can look up more about this on the internet, but I will tell you some about it. You get people to do a little thing now, they're more likely to do a bigger thing for you later. One example is campaigning for people to put lawn signs on their yards about some issue that affects the community. If you could knock on random doors and say, hey, can you put this lawn sign out about this important issue? Few people will do it. But if you say, hey, can you put this 3x3 sticker in your window about this important issue? That's a very small thing. More people will do that. Or say, can you wear this lapel pin about this thing? Maybe this pin just for a day. Then ask them again a week and a half later, hey, can you put this lawn sign on your yard? More people will put that lawn sign in the yard. Two more. Backfire effect. How many of you have heard of this already? All right, there's been some discussion about this in skepticism land. Researchers talked to people who were self-identified conservatives and self-identified liberals and presented them with misinformation about political figures. Like, there were WMDs found in Iraq. The Bush tax cuts increased government revenues. These are all, the opposite is what was true. The Bush administration imposed a total ban on stem cell research. Then, right after they gave this information, they're like, actually that's false, here's what's true, this is what actually happened. And then they measured to see if their corrections stuck. Because people have been told, we misinformed you, this actual other information is correct. And what they found was that, particularly the conservatives, even after being told they found WMDs in Iraq, no they didn't, actually this. Those conservatives were more likely to believe that we found WMDs. More likely. So sometimes when you present information to people, especially when it conflicts with their identities, that'll backfire and they'll hold their original beliefs even more strongly. Liberals didn't do it quite as much, but they tended to ignore facts that didn't agree with their identities and worldview. If the beliefs relate to our identities, like, well, conservatives think this and liberals think that, being presented with evidence doesn't necessarily change our beliefs. And that brings to social norms, which is one of the most difficult ones for us to want to like at CFI and outreach. Here's an example. A persuasion researcher worked with a hotel to make changes to signs encouraging the reuse of towels. Have you seen these kinds of things? Reuse your towel. What kinds of reasons do they give? Save the environment. Yeah, that's what most hotels say. They don't say, save us money, reuse your towel, because that won't work as well, right? F you, I'll use all the towels. But, but this persuasion researcher changed some of the signs to say, reuse your towel, please. Most guests reuse their towels. Or the majority of guests reuse their towels. That increased towel reuse by 26%. And they tried one that said, reuse your towels, please. Most guests reuse their towels, including the majority of people in room 308, the room you're staying in. So the group you're in, most people do this. That changed it even more. Towel reuse rate increased by 33%. Hate this. So you can motivate people to take action sometimes by letting them know that other people who are like them are taking action on that thing. And that brings me to kind of the end. Or maybe I'm just pretending it's the end. These psychology concepts, which can help us determine our tactics and how to make effective messaging, aren't just effective because people are ignorant. Because sometimes we think, well, if people knew more, they wouldn't fall for these traps. Often, actually, it's the more educated people who are more confident that they're making good decisions and are less likely to self-correct when presented with information that conflicts with their identity. They're better at rationalizing, right? So it's not just about education level or even intelligence. A lot of why we are like this is because of our identities. If we think progressives are like this, conservatives are like that, and we identify as one of those, we're less likely to change our beliefs even when confronted with evidence. You know this hockey stick graph? Some believe it's the best evidence we can show people, the best data we can show to show that global warming is real and is a big problem. Looks kind of like a hockey stick, right? But there's been research done. I'll give you a fun example. Imagine you're an environmental activist, dreadlock hippie with tattered clothes. And there's a businessman in your town who's making some decisions about purchasing in things that are bad for trees and bad for the environment and increase greenhouse gases. And you think you can convince him to change his behavior. And you go have a meeting with him and you say, hey man, the trees, the trees are dying and the oceans are warming and your business is doing bad things and, look at this hockey stick graph. This global warming is real, but you can do something about it. I just put a lot of variables in there, but I think you understand that that's not likely to be effective. It's more effective, firstly, if you show that you share some aspects of his identity, and also if you show that you share his values. So you wear a suit, or you get your friend who wears a suit, and a Republican haircut, and you say, hey man, sorry, dear sir, I wanted to talk to you about this important issue because I know you're a businessman and you are concerned about the bottom line. Oh, I see a picture of your family on your desk. I have a lot of young nieces I take care of. Family is very important to me and I'm concerned about the future. Look at this hockey stick graph. If this continues, your bottom line is going to be hurt. I don't know why. Because your air conditioning costs will go up or something, whatever it is. Then he's more likely to accept your evidence. In both cases, it's data. But one of them conflicts with and challenges his identity and values, and the other one is in line with it. We can use this to communicate more effectively with people when we're trying to persuade them to change their mind. And I know I'm way over time, so I'll just tell you a couple resources for learning more. Skeptical Activism Manual, you can go online and find it. They print it out for free. A few skeptics I work with have worked on this. This talks a lot about how to build campaigns and actually has worksheets in the back.
You're good.
Change of Heart, What Psychology Can Teach Us About Spreading Social Change by Nick Cooney. Looks like this. I love this book. This was one of the first books I got when I learned that I could read about how to be a better activist. And it has lots of citations and studies in the back. It talks about the backfire effect and foot and door and all these things. You can also look up presentations that he's given online about this in a summary form. We had him at our leadership conference a few years ago. I mentioned things about communicating your identity and your values to people if you want them to be more likely to accept your arguments and your data. Dan Kahan is amazing doing research on that. His website sometimes is over my head dense. I'm like, damn, look at this. I don't even know what you're saying. But this is what he does. He's talked about climate change. He's talked about a lot about politics. He's at Yale Law School doing this project. There are also books about social movements that you can look at. This is one that I'm about halfway through, and I've gone off from this and read a lot of other things, Lessons in Community Organizing and Advocacy, Stirred Up. Finally, since I'm out of time, thank you again for having me. I hope that some of these things stuck in your head, and that you can use these tools to be better activists and change the world. I don't need to tell you how important these kinds of things are, how important I believe they are, and how fundamental I think our movement values can be at creating the change we need to see in the world. And let me know if you have any questions at my table later, since I'm out of time. Thank you for your time.